Hi, everyone. This is Christine Chen. I'm the Executive Director for Asian and Pacific Islander American Vote. Right now, I would like to just make sure that everybody can hear us and see what is on the webinar. If you can, please raise your hand so that way I can see that you're not having any technical difficulties. Can folks raise their hand? That would be great. Okay, wonderful. We will go ahead and get started. Welcome. Thank you very much for coming on board to participate in this webinar, the 2012 Survey of Asian American and Pacific Islanders. It's a really exciting time for us to be able to explore this data and share it with you. Just to give you a little bit of background, APIAVote is a national Asian American Pacific Islander organization focused on increasing voter participation and civic participation on the national, state, and local level. The model that we use is really to work with local community partners across the country to help them build the capacity and interest in doing this type of work effectively. So at this time, what I'd like to do is go ahead and call upon our partner, EPIC, who's also one of our co-hosts for today's webinar, and introduce you to Sefa Aina.
Thanks, Christine, and thanks everyone for joining us today. I want to welcome you all, follow up on Christine's welcome to the EPIC APIAVote webinar on the 2012 National API Survey. First of all, I want to thank APIAVote and their leadership, particularly Christine, not only for setting up today's webinar, but for championing the task of registering AAPI to vote in this most important election. I also want to thank Professor Karthik Ramakrishnan for his amazing research on NHPIs, AAPIs, and taking time out of his busy teaching and research schedule to be with us. I also want to acknowledge Alisi Tulua, EPIC board member, who after seeing Professor Ramakrishnan present this work, reached out to Christine and helped to make today's webinar happen. Lastly, I want to thank all of the people on the call who represent the diversity in our NHPI community, culturally, regionally, and in area of expertise. Let me talk a little bit about EPIC. EPIC was established in 2009 by a group of young professionals who were and still are very active in the NHPI community. EPIC's mission statement is to mobilize Pacific Islander communities to foster culturally relevant opportunities for achieving social justice through advocacy, research, and development. As laid out in our mission statement, EPIC's three main guiding principles are advocacy, community development, and research. In terms of advocacy, EPIC has successfully partnered with legislators in the state of California to pass AB 1088 by Assemblymember Mike Eng, which disaggregates data in the state of California for the AAPI category. And as many of you know, data disaggregation is one of the main issues that we have to really being able to tell our story through legislators, to legislators, and to funders. We've also worked with Assemblymember Warren Furutani to pass ACR 67, which acknowledges the contributions that Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders have had in the state of California. In the area of community development, when thinking about community development, we're thinking beyond the hard structures and also working hard to develop the capacity of our individual community members. With the support of APIAVote, EPIC has registered, as of yesterday, 306 Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders throughout California to vote. We've also worked hard to send Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander college youth to Washington, D.C. to do internships and fellowships. We've also worked with local college students to do similar fellowships here in California. And we've created a group called EPIC Scholars, which is, for us, the next layer of leadership. These young professionals who are in the pipeline now, who we hope will come back and bring their skills to bear on our community. Lastly, in terms of our EPIC's guiding principles, it's really what we're here to talk about today, research. This is a nice segue to today's webinar because EPIC acknowledges that there's a dearth of research in the NHPI community. So Professor Ramakrishnan's efforts are so important. However, Professor Ramakrishnan will need the help and support of the folks on the call today to help contextualize the data that he'll be sharing. So he'll be sharing some wonderful information for us, but he'll be relying on folks participating to help build the context around that. And so without further ado, I want to turn it over to Professor Ramakrishnan.
Great, thank you, Sefa, and thank you, Christine, and to EPIC and Lisi and everyone else. It's great to be on this call and to see this level of engagement. And and despite all the praise, I'm not being too modest here. I mean, what I'm presenting to you is what we were able to do, and we were fortunate to be able to find a couple of funders who saw the importance of doing research on Pacific Islanders, on Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders, in addition to Asian Americans. But I'm a newbie when it comes to knowledge about this community, so I want to do as much listening as presenting. And I was telling the other organizers before that since this data has been collected, we've gotten some more recent data. So we will have we'll be able to do some even more deeper dives into the data in a few months in terms of, say, distinctions by gender or other divisions within the NHPI community than what we have here, which are just basically top-line comparisons. Thrilled to be here. I should note that so I direct the National Asian American Survey, but as we were very fortunate to be able to expand to Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders this time around, and we hope to be able to do that in the future. One thing I'll just give as a general motivation, more generally, to pay attention to Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. It's a growing group nationally. It has grown pretty rapidly. From 1960 to 2012, it's a dramatic rate of growth from 1 million to over 18 million. Between 2000 and 2010, Asian Americans were the fastest growing racial group, 46% versus 10% for the overall population. For Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders, this growth rate was 40%. So it's a little bit behind Latinos, but it's still 2 out of the top 3 fastest growing groups were Asian American on the one hand, and then Pacific Islander for the third fastest growing group. AAPIs are an important part of particular states, especially in California, where they are 15% of the state's residents, and this is looking at it either alone or in combination with one or more races. AAPIs are also important to the political process. In California, they're 10% of registered voters. In terms of the national election, there were 600,000 new AAPI voters in 2008, and they were going to play a significant role in battleground states like Nevada and Virginia, North Carolina, and Florida to some extent as well. Another reason to pay attention to AAPI is, now this is looking at Asian Americans here. The reason why it's looking at Asian Americans is that these national exit polls have limited coverage of AAPIs. They don't break out any numbers for Pacific Islanders. And even for Asian Americans, the interviews were only conducted in English and Spanish. This is not our survey. This is the survey that gets reported on CNN, NBC News, and the like on election day, on election eve. But limited though the data are, they allow us to go back in time, back all the way to 1992, where we see that Asian Americans went from voting about 30% for the Democratic candidate, that's for Bill Clinton in 1992, to nearly 2/3 in 2008. And this is the group that's had the most dramatic shift in terms of their voting allegiances. For Latinos, when you will see with that dashed line, that it's swung back and forth, but it's not as dramatic a shift as you see for Asian Americans. Now, the problem with just saying AAPIs is that Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders are much smaller than the Asian American population. And so they get drowned out, if you will. If you just report on statistics for AAPIs all lumped together, the Asian American side of that will be the vast majority of what counts as AAPI. So it's important whenever possible to try to disaggregate. It's relatively easy to do using official government data. The U.S. government since 2000 has been trying wherever possible to break out data for Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders, but there's still a lot of ways to go there. You have some government statistics like census data that are broken out that way, but often the numbers are too small with some of the other official records to have the breakouts for NHPIs, and that's an ongoing struggle. Just to take a step back, most people on this call would probably be well versed with what counts as Pacific Islander. According to the Office of Management and Budget, Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander refers to a person having origins in any of the original peoples of Hawaii, Guam, Samoa, or other Pacific Islands. So that's the official U.S. government definition. For the census, there are these check boxes, and who counts as NHPI in terms of how the census reports out that data depends on what boxes you check. So the Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islander population includes people who marked Native Hawaiian checkbox, or the Guamanian or Chamorro checkbox, the Samoan checkbox, or the other Pacific Islander checkbox with entries added in. It also includes people who reported entries such as Pacific Islander, Polynesian entries such as Tahitian, Tongan, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing this, Tokelauan, and then Micronesian entries such as Marshallese, Palauan, and Chukis, and Melanesian entries such as Fijian, Guinean, and Solomon Islander. So that's a pretty diverse group. Just even reading that, right? It's not as straightforward as it might seem if you just say Pacific Islander or even Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islander. Now it turns out that most of the Pacific Islanders, a majority, just over a majority, come from two groups, Native Hawaiians and Samoans. So Native Hawaiians account for 31% of the Pacific Islander NHPI population, and Samoans account for 20% of the population. And then the rest are all these other groups that you see here. In terms of growth of the NHPI population, as I said, they've grown by pretty dramatically by 40% since between Census 2000 and Census 2010, and that growth is there regardless if you look at alone, NHPI alone, or NHPI alone or in combination. In terms of the number of NHPIs, if you look at it alone or in combination, over 1 million Pacific Islanders, most broadly speaking, live in the United States together, as of 2010, a little over 1.2 million. Okay, I'll just then move on to our survey, and I'll note that the data that I'm reporting here reports on close to 350 NHPIs that we surveyed up through September 20th. These are 272 Native Hawaiians and 70 Samoans. We will have more. We have more data that have been incorporated in. We also have Tongans and Fijians, but the numbers aren't big enough to be able to report out on them. We have 40 Tongans that were interviewed and less than 10 Fijians. We did have people, Chamorros, who also self-identified, but those are in the single digits, and so we can't report out on that data. We would have had to do a lot more interviews to be able to do this. And something for the future to think about is maybe to post our survey online and have NHPI community organizations get their membership to take the survey. So it won't necessarily be as scientific as a random national sample of this population, but it might be a helpful tool for organizations to figure out what the priorities and preferences of their membership is. So that's just something I'll put out there, that we can certainly try to do an online survey in the coming year if that is helpful for you guys. In terms of the presidential vote, so at the bottom you see the results for Native Hawaiians and Samoans, and you can see how it compares to other groups. When it comes to the overall Asian American population, the patterns that we find are quite similar for Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders. You have about a 2-to-1 advantage for Obama over Romney overall for Asian Americans, and you have about a third of them that are undecided. You have a fewer proportion who are undecided among Native Hawaiians, but you still have this advantage for Obama over Romney in terms of their presidential vote choice. Among Samoans, you have a slightly greater proportion of people who say that they intend to vote for Obama. If you compare to other Asian groups, support for Obama is, it's similar to what you find for Chinese Americans, but it is significantly lower than what you find, say, for Indian Americans or Cambodians or Hmong. It's similar to what you find for Japanese and Korean Americans. Now this proportion of undecided voters, once we have this newer data, what we found for the Asian American side is there wasn't that much of a change, and I anticipate the similar thing would be true for Pacific Islanders too. It's just our populations are much more likely to take their time in making up their mind. So this proportion of undecided is about 3 or 4 times the national average. In terms of the proportion of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders living in battleground states, 17% is for Asian Americans, and then for Pacific Islanders, 13% for Native Hawaiians and 14% for Samoans. These proportions are significantly lower than they are for whites and African Americans. For them, it's about 1/3 of their national population lives in battleground states. And for Latinos, it's between where it is for African Americans and where it is for Asian Americans. It's in the 20s. And this, it's about 1/4. And this is significant because to the extent that a lot of the attention is being paid to the battleground states, our communities are less likely to be contacted and get attention, not only because we are smaller, but we are also less likely to live in battleground states. And this comes through in terms of whether people were contacted to vote or not. If you look at whether or not people were contacted, 19% of Asian American likely voters said that they were contacted by parties or candidates in the past year. 13% said they were contacted by some other source, like an independent political organization or a community organization. You see for Pacific Islanders that contact by parties or candidates is much low. I mean, it's low for Asian Americans. It's even lower for NHPIs. Only 6% of likely voters say that they've been contacted by parties or candidates. So this is a significant issue. I mean, even though you have so many NHPIs concentrated in states like Hawaii and California where their numbers are significant, overall the picture is that they are not being contacted. In terms of where people stand on the issues, what we have for Asian Americans is very similar for AAPIs. Here I'm just presenting the overall statistics because there is no appreciable difference between the two groups. The economy, unemployment, healthcare, and education, those are the top 4 issues, with economy and unemployment the most significant. We also asked people what is a key issue for the election, and again, education and jobs end up being very significant. But there are some other issues like the budget deficit and healthcare that are also very important to the vote. In terms of the economy, this is a significant issue for Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, and we asked. There are a few different measures of economic hardship that we asked. One is since the economic crisis of 2008, have you experienced a foreclosure on a home? For Asian Americans, 5% of them said that they did, and the national average is about 1%, although a higher proportion in the U.S. have said that they've missed payments. But 1% say that they've experienced a foreclosure on their home. There could be some over-reporting in our survey compared to the national average, but there are other studies that show about a 40 to 50% greater rate of foreclosures among Asian Americans than the national average. Here, when we compare Pacific Islanders to Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians are about the same as Asian Americans in terms of their experience with foreclosure, but Samoans have the highest rates of, they report the highest rates of foreclosure activity, similar to what we find with the Southeast Asian populations of Cambodian and Hmong, 11% of them. So about 1 in 9 Samoan adults say that they have experienced a foreclosure in the last 4 years. In terms of job loss, we find the results for Native Hawaiians and Samoans to be similar to what we find for Asian Americans. 14% of Asian Americans say that they've lost a job in the last 4 years. For Native Hawaiians, it's 15%, and Samoans is 12%. This is all within the margin of error for these groups, so we can't really say that they're much different from each other. But this is important to note because often we only hear about snapshots in time in terms of what the unemployment rate is for any particular group. What this shows you is that if you add up people who lost jobs and maybe regained them or lost them again, it affects a much higher proportion of the community than we see, at least for Asian Americans, in terms of the national statistics that get reported out. We also asked people whether some of these economic issues were a very serious problem for themselves and their household. And I'm presenting here the data for Pacific Islanders. They are similar to Asian Americans, except the cost of college is mentioned much more among Pacific Islanders than it is among Asian Americans. So college affordability is a huge concern. The cost of taking care of the elderly is also a very big concern among Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders. And then some of the other issues that were also high for Asian Americans are not as high for NHPIs. So medical debt, the cost of rent or making mortgage payments or credit card debt are not as high as we found for Asian Americans. But the cost of college remains to be, that is much higher among the Pacific Islanders in our sample. Now turning next to health, which is the next most important issue after the economy, we asked people their opinions on the Affordable Care Act. And we find that Pacific Islanders are actually more divided than Asian Americans in terms of their opinions on the Affordable Care Act. So Asian Americans favor the Affordable Care Act. This was President Obama's signature healthcare reform law. Asian Americans approve it by about a 3-to-1 ratio, but about a third of them having neither a favorable or unfavorable opinion. That one third is similar to what you find for Pacific Islanders, but if you look at the comparison here between favorable and unfavorable, that margin is much smaller than it is for Asian Americans. For half of the interviewees, we didn't ask them about the Affordable Care Act. We instead used the word Obamacare to see if it would have any change in opinion. For Asian Americans, it didn't have much of a change, and neither did it for Pacific Islanders. What it does do is it reduces the proportion of people who say that they're neutral, neither favorable or unfavorable. That goes down. But what you see is that an increase in those who have a favorable view, but also an increase in those who don't have a favorable view. And most of that is coming from the decline in proportion who don't have an opinion. So the patterns don't change, but more people know what the law is among Pacific Islanders when you say Obamacare as opposed to the Affordable Care Act. And that's interesting, and it's important, I think, to look at what outreach in the Pacific Islander community needs to look like as the Affordable Care Act. I mean, already it's getting implemented, but as different provisions get implemented, it suggests that there might be some important outreach efforts that need to be made, at least to reduce the proportion who don't know, and to also be aware of different aspects of the Act. Next, we also asked questions about affirmative action, and we asked whether Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders had a favorable view or an unfavorable view of affirmative action programs that are designed to help women, blacks, and other minorities get better jobs and education. And we find that for both Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, there's strong support for affirmative action. Now again, we did a split sample where for part of our sample, we introduced this logic of diversity that people have been talking about. So a lot of the legal arguments now for affirmative action don't talk about social injustice or unequal playing fields. They talk about the need for diversity. So we said, in order to improve diversity, would you favor or oppose affirmative action programs? And there we find that for Pacific Islanders, there's actually a decline in support and an increase in opposition to affirmative action. So what this suggests is that the simplest message on affirmative action produces the most support instead of trying to complicate it with grappling with this issue of diversity or non-diversity. Finally, in terms of opinion on undocumented immigration, we didn't find much significant difference between Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. Generally speaking, they support the path to citizenship, but they narrowly don't support in-state tuition and driver licenses for undocumented immigrants. And you have a significant chunk of people who neither agree nor disagree with that statement. So I'll leave it at that. Those are the kind of major findings that we have. So some of the significant things that come out are in terms of the economic hardship measures, especially among Samoans. We see higher levels than we see for Asian Americans. We see the affordability of college. That is an issue that pops up more significant among NHPIs. And then finally, on things like healthcare reform, we actually see more divided opinion among NHPIs than among Asian Americans. But on issues like affirmative action, we see similar levels of support for affirmative action. I'll leave it at that, and then happy to take any questions, but Sefa, I think, might have some thoughts as well, and he can chime in.
Okay, at this time, we will open it up for Q&A. If you can, please go ahead and raise your hand, or you could go ahead and type in your question. Any questions or comments? Okay, we have a question from Sora. Go ahead. Sora, you are unmuted. Go ahead. I think there's some technical difficulties. We can't hear you, so maybe if you can, go ahead and type in your question down below. Other questions? Sefa, are there any particular questions or comments that you want to go ahead and note while we wait for other questions?
Sure. Sure. I mean, I picked up on a lot. First of all, I want to thank you, Karthik, for the wonderful presentation. You know, especially noticed some of the issues around economic hardship and, you know, why it seems lower than, well, statistically, it looks lower than what it seems. It seems like the community is definitely having much more hardship than sort of reflected in there. And I'm not sure if that has to do with, you know, folks not willing to share certain types of information, or even understanding sort of the questions that are being asked. You know, I think in the Pacific Islander community, there's a strong sense of sort of pride and you know, and especially in terms of holding your own burden and stuff like that, and keeping private about things like your financial situation. So I'm wondering if any of that kind of comes in, because the percentages seem a lot lower than what the percentages are a lot lower than what it seems like, you know, in terms of what I see in the community, what I've experienced through in my interactions with different folks from around the country. I don't know if you had any thoughts about that, Karthik.
Yeah, those are excellent points. I mean, one thing we can, so these data are weighted according to gender and educational attainment. So one of the things I thought about is, you know, maybe we got a more educated sample than in the population, and so maybe that's we're underestimating the hardship, but it's weighted at least on that. There are two things I think that could still be, two factors that could still be at play. One is people who have experienced a lot of hardship may be less likely to take a telephone survey. Now, this telephone survey was conducted both on landlines and cell phones, but still, you may be less likely to be reachable by a landline or cell phone if you're going through a lot of economic hardship. Or if you have a cell phone, you may be less likely to answer the phone. So that could be, but it could also be what you say, and I need to go back into the data to look at the proportion of people who say don't know as opposed to saying yes or no. And that might be some of the key difference, is if there is a stigma, if there is pride, maybe people are saying don't know or refusing to answer the question as opposed to saying yes or no. So that might be something fruitful there, is to not just take the proportion who say yes, but look at the opposite of the people who say no, you know? And so that might be interesting and important to do for this particular community. I see some other questions, Christine. I don't know if I should take some of them.
Okay, yes. One of the questions from Evan Dora is what states or cities were these surveys conducted?
So this is a nationally representative sample. So this is, in terms of where we derive the samples to then call people, we got it from all 50 states. Now I could go into my statistical side and you'll just see some really like rough data. If people are okay with that, I can just go into my statistical application and see. But essentially, most of the data will come from California and Hawaii, but you do have people coming from other states as well in our survey. It is nationally representative. And I can, in the future, in the future, if we come up, the report that we have is largely an Asian American and Pacific Islander report, but it doesn't dive deeper into the Pacific Islander community. I think with the benefit of time, next year we can come up with a more detailed report that shows that state breakdown in terms of where people come from, but it is coming from all over the country.
Let me go ahead and read up the other question while you work on that. This is from Vanessa. Our NHPI communities are very much faith-based. Did the survey or will the survey address traditional marriage versus marriage equality?
Another excellent question. So we do have questions on various questions about abortion and on LGBT rights, and those advocates working on those issues need some time to kind of digest that. They didn't want us to release the results right away until they have time to process it, and also as we get more data to get more precise estimates. But we are seeing that on some of these traditional issues, our populations are responding to the way that we would have thought even before doing a survey, that there is a fair amount of unease with issues like gay marriage, that and I think areas to be worked on in terms of educating our communities. But that is, we do have questions on that, and we're hoping to release that data after the election, hopefully in early 2013.
Okay, this one is also from Sora. Let's see. Actually, I'm sorry. Actually, this one's from Vanessa. Was there a similar chart created for AAPI trend to support Republican or other parties?
Oh, so in terms of that, if that data over time, it would just be the mirror image. So for Republicans, it would be, there was a high level of Republican support in the 1990s, in the early 90s, but then it declines over time. So for AAPI, and that's, to be fair, it's actually Asian American data, not AAPI data. That's just using the national election pool data, and that would just be a mirror image in which it would be higher in 1992, and then it goes down by 2008. And that is something that, I don't know how, I know in terms of what Republican outreach Republican outreach looks like in the Asian American community, and also what the party image of Republicans is in the largely immigrant Asian American population. But I don't know as well what Republican outreach has looked like with NHPI communities, and I imagine that outreach in Hawaii would be quite different than outreach in the mainland. But this is where I reach the limit of what I know in terms of what Republican or Democratic Party outreach within the Pacific Islander community looks like. But maybe someone else has thoughts on that.
Setha, do you want to comment on that? I do know that traditionally what I have seen is that at least the Romney campaign has been doing some specific outreach to Pacific Islanders in Nevada. And I do know that the Obama campaign has also done a lot of outreach in Nevada and California.
Well, I think Yeah, I can't really speak to it with any real certainty with regards to what the Republican Party has done in terms of outreach. I think the Republican message resonates with a lot of Pacific Islanders, particularly those in the faith-based who consider themselves, very religious. I think this pro-life, traditional marriage is a really big thing. I think social issues are really important for Pacific Islanders who consider themselves religious. The other things about sort of there's this sort of idea that as Pacific Islanders, we're self-reliant people. Now whether that's actually true in real life and whether or not we actually need help and need support and need a government that it can account for some of the historical sort of barriers that have been there. That's another question, but I think as a community, I think there's a strong spirit of trying to do things for yourself, and I think when you tag the one party as being sort of an enabler and handicapper of community, then I think that works against them. So I think I can't be too sure or specific about specific campaigning in different communities, but I can say that the message that the Republican Party has, I think, resonates a lot with Pacific Islanders because of certain values that they have. Now, I think there's a lot of work to be done in terms of fleshing out what those values actually are and what they really mean and how they change over time. But I think that could account for the large numbers of Republicans in the NHPI community.
Great. The next question is from Sora. To what degree is the concern over cost of college related to enrollment in private, possibly for-profit colleges? Might the PI sample be enrolled in such colleges? And then after you answer that, Karthik, I will open it up for James Latoa, who also has a question.
Great. So that's an excellent question. We only asked in terms of what is the highest level of educational attainment that they have had, but we didn't ask the name of the college that they attended. But if there is, the issue of private and for-profit colleges and not just the debt that people get into, but the debt that they get into without completing their degrees has been shown to be higher among people who go to some of these private for-profit colleges, and the kind of earnings that they get is not as sometimes as promised. We can't do that in our study, but I think that if there is a gap, say between Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, that very well might account for that difference in terms of why the college cost burden seems to be significantly higher among NHPIs than among Asian Americans.
Go ahead, James. You've been unmuted. Go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you, Christine. It's good to hear from you. My question is regarding to the Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander community. As we can tell, our community, I was just curious, during your survey, did you ever run into problems with Pacific Islander community not understanding? Maybe there was a language barrier, or was there any translation with our community?
Yeah, so in this regard, we were limited in terms of the language capacity of the survey firm that we used, and we also went based with what English proficiency in the NHPI community, generally speaking, was large enough that we thought that we weren't suffering too much from representativeness, that there would be someone in the household who speaks English who would be able to take the survey. But that's a point well taken. The survey for the Pacific Islanders, most of them took it in English, and we had the availability of the survey in various Asian languages and Spanish and English, but not in any Pacific Islander languages per se. So that is a limitation of the study that we readily acknowledge.
Great. I'm going to go ahead, and I believe Setha also wanted to go ahead and chime in.
Hello. Thanks, Christine. I'd like to go back to sort of the college question, the very serious problems acknowledged by the NHPI folks who answered that question, and the cost of college. I think it was surprising to me, and I thank Sora for her question, because I totally overlooked the high number of Pacific Islanders who go to these private for-profit colleges and end up in a serious amount of debt because of that. The other thing that brings up to me, and I question about that particular question and the responses is, you know, there's a lot of the process for getting funded for college is very mystified. I think it's tough for higher middle income families to send kids to college, but it's very financially speaking, it's a lot easier for low income families to do so because of the amount of scholarships and funding that's out there for low-income students. It's just a matter of educating our community about those opportunities. The other thing I'll say is if it is because of the private for-profit colleges that's causing this economic hardship, I think one of the other things that we need to consider doing as a community is really focusing on our younger pipeline. A lot of times people go to these private for-profit colleges because there's no academic restrictions to go in there. You just have to pay. There's no application process. You don't have to take any SATs or ACTs or anything like that. So just in terms of offering you, Karthik, some context around that question, I think it was really surprising to a lot of folks. But I think it's a really interesting point. I think the second one, the cost of taking care of our elderly parents, is, you know, that didn't surprise me one bit. I think it's true for Pacific Islanders. You know, we tend to keep our own family with us, and you know that's something that we take on, but it could be a financial burden to some. But yeah, I just wanted to add some more context around the college question. Thanks.
Vanessa also had a follow-up question, and to follow up on the previous question, what is the purpose behind withholding some of the data, particularly the data on traditional marriage versus marriage equality and so forth, until after the elections? So Karthik, maybe you also want to talk about how much, like, more digging deeper you will actually be going through after the elections because of the time constraints. And then also the other question is, you use the term advocates. How do we differentiate advocacy versus nonpartisan research?
Right. So first of all, this is absolutely, I mean, research in terms of the way we collect the data is, for me, I'm a professor, and my interest is a scientific one, and it's not partisan in the sense of advocating for one candidate or another. When I meant the term advocates, I was talking about issues, particular issues like on abortion, pro or con, or on LGBT rights. And on that, the reason why we're withholding is not for it to be after the election, because there are some states where this is on the ballot, but we don't even have large enough sample sizes in those states to provide any kind of reasonable estimate of where opinion stands. So it's not like we are withholding any information that would be relevant to those elections. In places like where LGBT rights are on the ballot this year, we just don't have enough data to provide anything useful from these populations. But part of it is that we haven't had time to digest the data, and the way that we're working with groups that helped get it. I mean, we put questions on there for groups that raised funding to be able to ask those questions, and our agreement is for them to have time to look at the data after all the data is in. We don't have all the data in. We just are finishing up those interviews this week. So once that data is in and we're able to clean it up and analyze it and give it to them, then we'll go through the process of doing community outreach in terms of how we make sense of the data. So it's not to suppress the information or to influence the election in any way.
Okay, are there any other questions? You could go ahead and raise your hand or go ahead and type it in. One question is, can we release all the general data on the social issues such as marriage equality versus marriage, abortion, etc. before the elections?
I just answered that question. So so this one thing I'll say is that this is basically a 1.5 person enterprise. So the kinds of surveys that so like the Pew Research Center, the survey that they did, they had dozens of people working on the survey. Well, maybe not dozens, but at least many people working on the survey. So it's hard to get to be working through this entire data set. But there is a process in which we are going to be releasing the data on some of those other issues. One thing you'll note is that in terms of what are the most important issues in the election, people had the chance to say those top 2 issues, and none of these social issues were anywhere. They weren't even in the top 7 or 8, right? So these are just very, very low salience issues for the AAPI community. The AAPI community might have opinions on a particular matter, but whether it's going to matter for the election at all, the answer is pretty clear. Fewer than 1% of them mention any kind of social issue that is relevant to this election. In a different election, it might have been different, but the economy and then healthcare and education pretty much drowns out everything else.
Thank you, Karthik. Even Dora has a question. How soon can we expect to see this data after it's been digested, and where can we expect to see it?
So the plan is to we're going to have more outreach efforts in the winter and spring of 2013. So happy to, I think on that we'll need to talk with EPIC to see what might be the next kind of appropriate venue, but I'm still teaching a class this quarter. I need to finish out with that, and then so it'll happen after winter break, not before.
Great. Any other questions before we close out? Okay, seeing that there are no hands raised and no other questions being listed, on behalf of EPIC and APIAVote, I would like to thank once again to Karthik and Teku for taking the leadership for creating this project. For those who don't know, this similar survey was actually conducted in 2008, but in 2012, with this one with the extra funding, we were able to oversample Pacific Islander communities. So it's really exciting. We look forward to working with many of you in the near future and ensuring that this data is utilized and digested correctly. This webinar was recorded, and so we expect by next week it will be posted up on APIAVote's website as well as EPIC's, and everyone that had RSVP'd to this webinar will actually receive a link to that, so that way you can share this information with your colleagues as well. So thank you very much and have a great afternoon.